introduction, what I understood of it. I think this is one of the longest biographical introductions I've ever listened to, and I'm glad you're still here. Thank you very much. I'm really flattered and humbled by this. And I think there's very little that you don't know about me anymore, right? Anyway, I've given probably thousands and thousands of lectures in my life. I've received many, many awards. I hold this as a very special award, the professorship, the Mercator-Professorship. But I also would like to say that I've rarely seen such efficiency and professionalism in preparing for this, for these visits and for the lectures and in the follow-up. And that's why I want to make sure that I mention everybody who's been involved in this preparation. All the wonderful people here. And of course, I will start with Prof.Dr. Eckhart Hasselbrink. And forgive me if I mispronounce names or I don't follow university hierarchy. Of course, Professor Dr. Jochen Hippler, whom you will see later on. Where are you? Ah, there you go. And Scarlett Brunner-Waver, good pronunciation. And of course, Dr. Ingrid Lotz-Ahrens and Professor Dr. Michael Keres, right? And Dr. Sabina Zix, right? Is Zix right? And Ms. Beate Kostka, and of course, Julia Herzendorf. All these people have been working very hard to bring me here, and I'm very grateful. But it's just this combination of warmth and professionalism that I really enjoy. And many people, and appreciate, many people said, how come you're coming to Germany, you're going to Germany, even though the situation at home is so bad and things are really disastrous. And I said, I think there are two things that all politicians have to learn, and I pride myself on being an academic before I'm a politician. One thing is that nobody is indispensable, and this is a very important lesson. I wrote about the graceful exit. Sometimes people have to know when to leave, not just when to get involved. But anyway, nobody is indispensable, and that's really important because every politician thinks he or she has a lifetime mandate in the office and in the chair. And two, when you make a commitment, you have to honor it. I made this commitment and I'm going to honor it. Many politicians seem to think that commitments are made just for verbal exercises, not in order to be implemented. So I'm happy to be here again, and the Essen part of the university, and it's wonderful to be with you. So it is a privilege and an honor to be awarded the professorship. Well, 2 months ago, the lecture, as you knew, focused on narratives and legitimacies, and therefore it was rather introspective and historical, with an assessment of the intrinsic components of the Palestinian question, including issues of integrity, identity, the basic components, historical affirmation, and even redemption. We saw, as somebody said, the peace process. We saw a lot of process, but very little peace. But we're talking about a redemptive process. We talked about the dual injustice of dispossession, dispersion, and exile on the one hand, and the repression and oppression or captivity of the occupation on the other hand. And these two mark the two major stations in Palestinian history, in contemporary history, in relation to Israel. The establishment of the State of Israel in UN Resolution 181 in 1947 that gave Israel 56% of historical Palestine, and the war of 1948. By 1949, Israel had taken 22% more, so it had 78% of historical Palestine 60 years ago, and the war of June 5th, 1967, and the occupation of the rest of Palestine, the 22% remaining, which are now referred to as the West Bank, including Jerusalem and Gaza. We also discussed the need to move from, and this urge that we've been trying to realize, from mutual negation, mutual exclusion, delegitimization, to a situation of mutual affirmation, inclusion, and re-legitimization, particularly in relation to the Palestinian narrative. And we addressed the essential instruments, the required instruments, being a viable, substantive, credible, effective peace initiative that would lead to the evolution of statehood and evolution of the occupation. And I'm trying to just recap some of the things we discussed, so I'm not speaking in a vacuum. And we also discussed the permanent status issues that had to be resolved if there is to be a just peace, if there is to be a real resolution of the conflict. And the permanent status issues are, of course, the refugees, Jerusalem, boundaries, settlements, water, and regional security as well. These form the agenda for permanent status negotiations, and according to all involved, there should be no unilateral actions to preempt or prejudge or prejudice the outcome of these issues that are supposed to be negotiated. We talked about no unilateral measures, no power politics, and no violations of international legality or law, or humanitarian law. Now, both in substance and procedure, peace requires a political will, the courage, and the vision, as well as the positive, constructive third-party engagement. Again, last time we said it cannot be unilateral because unilateralism is the imposition of the will of the strong on the weak. And it cannot be bilateral because we have an asymmetry of power since we are occupier and occupied. We are not two independent sovereign states negotiating a border dispute. No, we are a people under occupation being subject to the most extreme measures of violence, land confiscation, and others. And it cannot be anything but multilateral because it is an international responsibility, it is a global endeavor, and it must be based on international law and UN resolutions. This leads me to the subject, to the focus of this talk this evening, which is context. I'm not just doing this to spite the neocons. Everybody knows I have a running dispute with the neoconservatives in the States because they always like to decontextualize, and I will talk about this later in the global context. But today I want to address the context itself of not just Palestine, but the whole conflict and the occupation and regional as well as global realities. Peace cannot be done in a vacuum, cannot emerge from a vacuum, both in time and space, but is an extension of and an outcome or a resolution of historical and contemporary realities, as well as within, as an endeavor that is within the principles and imperatives of a global rule of law, if there is to be such thing. We talk about states being responsible for the rule of law within states, and I think it's important that states are subject to a global rule of law so that they are held accountable in terms of their behavior. Now, the 20th century marked the codification of globalization, and I'm not talking here about economic globalization, there are many issues there, but the codification of a new type of globalization through a body of legal instruments and international organizations to protect the vulnerable and to curb the unrestricted use of unaccountable power. Thus, following or perhaps second to the formulation and spread of religions and ideologies that formed a sort of commonality, the universality of human rights became the most effective tool for the humanization of globalization. And of course, international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Conventions and all these things were formulated in order to protect the vulnerable, in order to protect civilian populations, not just states. And of course, in order to provide for a global rule of law, despite the absence of even-handedness, whether in monitoring or in enforcement. The UN does not have any enforcement power or punitive power, actually. And despite the fact that there is no way in which genuine accountability can be provided for the perpetrator, and there is no genuine protection for the victim, but at least there is a framework, there is a codification of these laws that are important. Thus, in the 20th century, or since the middle of the 20th century, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, which is, of course, in the UN Charter, and all articles of the Fourth Geneva Conventions provided the anchor for the legality and morality of the Palestinian question, despite the fact that they were never respected or applied by the international community. And by now you're all aware of the double standards always enforced in terms of the Palestinians, where some resolutions are to be implemented even by force. Remember, the US went to war on the basis of UN resolutions having to be enforced. But when it comes to the Palestinians, they are shelved. They're in the archives. They're collecting dust somewhere. We have numerous resolutions, but we also have lots of vetoes that the US exercised in the Security Council. Now, the Palestinians continued to be deprived of the protection of the law, and I talked about this last time, dehumanized and denied. And as a result, at a certain point in our history, we resorted to negative means to make our message heard, to reach the world's consciousness, if not conscience. Today we mark 3 days, was it 2 or 3 days, the passing of Dr. George Habash of the PFLP, who started the plane hijackings and so on, and began and he said this is negative attention. Before this, the world never heard of the Palestinians. Now, no matter what, at least they know they cannot ignore us. So they used negative means in order to get attention, in order to reach people's consciousness. And we resorted then, in the late 60s and the 70s, the resistance, the armed struggle, the revolution. The PLO in the 60s, of course, became the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And since then, since the 60s, there was an evolution of the political agenda and discourse. Up to 1974, I'm rapidly just going through this to show you the evolution of the political program, where we accepted what is called the transitional solution, that any part of Palestine that is liberated, we will set up our Palestinian entity on. Up to 1988, when the Palestine National Council, the parliament in exile, adopted or declared issued the Declaration of Independence and accepted the two-state solution and adopted the peace initiative. We accepted UN resolutions 141, 242, and 338, which later formed the basis of the peace process that was launched in Madrid in 1991. So there was an evolution from the Shuqairi days when, and we'll talk about this, when the PLO was a sort of an Arab organization under the jurisdiction or control of the Arab regimes, and when gradually it was people like Arafat and the Palestinian Revolution that talked about the independence of the Palestinian decision-making and made sure that the Palestinian question had a life and an integrity of its own. That is, it wasn't just an Arab question, that there was a Palestinian identity and a national cause. And of course, at that time, I remember we talked about the Palestinians being looked at through the two views, and I call them the Aristotelian vision of the Palestinians as being subjects or objects of pity and fear. We were either the pitiful refugees or the fearful terrorists, but we were never really a people in our humanity, a people with a narrative, with a history, with a culture, with an identity. And ever since then, we've been trying to tell the rest of the world that we are there, we're not going to disappear, and we do have a national identity, and our cause is a cause of national self-determination and freedom. Now, within regional realities, the Palestinian question has always been the most focal and the most emotive issue that has shaped attitudes and perceptions in the Arab and in the Islamic world, if not in the whole world.